Today, I'm installing an oil cooler and oil filter relocation adapter for my Autozam AZ-1. I'm trying to improve cooling while also making future maintenance easier by relocating the oil filter. First, we'll go over the parts used, which are listed in the description. Then, I'll build some brackets, put together custom oil lines, button everything up and replace the fluids, and finally, make some air ducting. This is a Greddy 3/4 by 16 oil filter adapter. It threads directly onto the engine where the stock oil filter would normally go. It has 2 sensor ports and a 60mm O-ring. Total weight is about 324 grams. From here, we'll run AN10 lines to the thermostatic oil filter relocation block. The relocation block is also a Greddy unit. There's another 1/8 PT port and a drain plug near the thermostat, which can be adapted to fit additional sensor ports if required. On the back, there are 2 M8 threaded holes for mounting. The oil filter threads directly onto it, just like it would on the engine. Here I have an OEM filter, but the relocation block allows you to use a much wider range of sizes. The built-in thermostat opens between 70 and 80 degrees Celsius. While the engine is warming up, oil flows from the block to the filter and then back to the engine, bypassing the cooler. For the oil cooler, I'm using a Mishimoto 19 row. It weighs 1,500 grams and adds about half a liter of capacity. For lines and fittings, I went with a budget AN10 kit from Evil Energy. Now we need to make a bracket for the filter relocation block. I decided to mount the oil filter relocation on the frame rail just in front of the engine. Frame already has 2 holes here. One is blank and then one has a captive M6 thread. I drilled out the existing hole using an 11/32 drill bit to fit a steel M6 riv nut. I find it best practice to drill the hole as tight as possible and use red Loctite to discourage the riv nut from moving in the future. To get the bracket placement just right, I took measurements and did a pencil rubbing of the mounting surface of the frame. This gave me a good reference for the hole positions. I made a cardboard template and test fit it on the car before cutting it out of 16-gauge steel. I bent the bracket using a bench vise, vice grips, and a hammer. It would have been easier with a metal brake, but for something this simple, this method works fine. If you're watching this and thinking, hey, it looks like you're bending it backwards, that's because I bent it backwards. Already living up to the error part of this channel. But it was an easy fix. I cleaned up the edges with a file, marked and drilled all the holes, and did some quick deburring. I don't have access to a metal shop right now, so this is all pretty low budget, but that's all you need for something as simple as this. After the final test fit, I gave the bracket a light sanding and a few coats of high-temp paint to keep it clean and rust-free. I installed the lower riv nut last, in case the bracket design changed as I worked. One more test fit to confirm everything lined up, and it's good to go. Now we'll mount the oil cooler. I decided to mount it directly to the firewall. To make things easier, I created a drill template and worked from inside the cabin instead of trying to reach around the engine bay. I installed riv nuts and test fit the cooler from the inside to make sure spacing was correct. For vibration dampening, I cut rubber gaskets from an old motorcycle inner tube and bolted the cooler in place. To add a bit more stability, I made another bracket that supports the top of the cooler. Same process as before, just eyeballed the measurements. I reused an existing hole in the body that originally held a wire tie. I shaped the bracket to clear the wiring, hit it with a few coats of paint, and mounted it. The cooler is very solid mounted like this, and looking at it from the outside, it is well aligned for airflow, but we'll make this even better a little later. Brackets done, we'll move on to making the AN10 lines. There are lots of tutorials on making these lines, so I won't go too deep. The process is basically just fitting one end and then routing the line for measurements before cutting and fitting the other end. It's a good idea to apply a bit of masking tape right below the fitting while you're tightening it to make sure you don't push the hose out. I also found wrapping the hose in masking tape and then a layer of electrical tape made for clean cuts without any fraying. I test fit the adapters so that I could measure the last two lines. I also mocked up the wiring for the new sensor locations. You'll need a 27mm deep socket to mount the adapter to the engine block to 54 foot-pounds. The layout forced me to install the hoses and sensors in a specific order, which I'm not thrilled about, since it means I'll have to reverse that order if I ever need to take it apart. It's not ideal, but it works. All in all, it's just 4 lines, and I ended up using a bit under 10 feet of hose. With the lines done, it's time to prep all the components for mounting and then fill the oil. I had a sandwich plate on the car for my temperature and pressure sensors, so I removed that and cleaned the sensors to reuse them. If anyone wants the sandwich plate, just let me know. It's a Geron K-spec with 2 sensor ports, and obviously it fits with the OEM filter. I prepped all the fittings with some Teflon tape and engine oil. I then torqued each one down to 12 foot-pounds. When you attach the AN lines, it's important you hold these fittings in place so they don't get over-torqued into the adapter. Pre-filling the cooler was a bit of a challenge. I wanted to avoid spilling oil everywhere, so I ended up connecting the return line from the cooler to the relocation block and then snaking the feed line through the engine access door and filling it up from outside the car. I added about half a liter of oil to the cooler and then connected the line back to the relocation block. After checking that everything was secure, I added the remaining 3 liters of oil to the top of the engine. I removed the ignition fuse and cranked the car for a few seconds. Everything looked good, so I let the car idle while watching for any signs of leaks. Finding none, I took the car out to get it up to temperature and performed another leak check. Again, everything looked great, so it's time to build the air ducts. Making the ducting to direct airflow from the side vents took a few hours, but it will definitely help airflow through the cooler. I templated everything in cardboard and cut it out of a thin aluminum sheet. The panel is pretty flimsy, so I did a few things to strengthen it. I added a few beads across the face of the duct and flanged the edges. You can do this with a hammer and vise or anvil or any sharp-edged chunk of metal. I used a jack since most of my metal tools are packed up right now, but a bead roller would do the job in a few minutes. This metal is thin and flexible, so soft taps with the hammer are enough to shape it without damaging it. The beads and the flanged edge make a huge difference in keeping the panel rigid. After test fitting the panel, it seemed like vibration might be an issue. So I added a layer of butyl rubber to one side of each of the panels. I'm really happy with how these came out, and you can hear the difference when I drop it. When I mounted the panels, I also added some weather strip to make a better seal and further reduce vibrations. I made one more steel bracket for the lower front edge of the cooler ducting. Everything is tight and there are no noticeable vibrations. Double checking the oil, everything looks good. Now, I daily drive this car in the southern United States, where summer temps are typically between 95 and 105 degrees. Before I installed the oil cooler, I was regularly seeing oil temps around 120 degrees Celsius, especially using a thinner oil or on a long highway drive. This is the car getting on the highway and driving for about 5 minutes at 70 miles an hour before I reached a stable 100 degrees Celsius. So the total cost for this oil cooler setup came in at a bit under 500 US dollars, including all parts, hardware, and consumables. The actual install took me about 3 days, working off and on, but I'd been thinking about how best to do it for a while. This is a very doable project, as long as you're prepared to figure out some unplanned issues as they come up. That's like 70 miles an hour. During the summer, I mostly run Mobil 1 full synthetic, 15W50, and 10W40 in the winter here. With the cooler installed, oil pressure has stayed solid, usually just under or right around 4 bar at 4,000 RPM. On average, the cooler has dropped my high temps by about 10 or 15 degrees Celsius. It seems like I'm topping out around 110 degrees now. One nice thing about this project is that you don't really reach the point of no return until the very end. You can mock up the cooler, the mounting brackets, and even the relocation block without ever tapping into your oil system. Up until you attach the engine block, you can walk away from the project for a few days if you need to. Overall, I'm happy with how this install turned out. Using the right oil and keeping up with oil changes is probably more important than any of the parts that I added, but the filter relocation will make that much easier in the future. The parts I chose worked well for me and seem to be high quality. You can relocate the filter without adding a cooler, which would cost about half as much and will still be a great upgrade for the AZ-1. The same drive later in the day, after it had been 100 degrees Fahrenheit for a few hours, my temperatures were steady at about 110 degrees Celsius for oil and high 90s for water. That's all there is to it. I appreciate you watching and I hope this was helpful. I'm looking forward to the next one.